So I'm going to kind of break up this presentation into sort of the body of work that I've done since 2019, and then feed into sort of where I see myself going with the privilege of making a site-specific project for the museum. And I'm going to just proceed. So my background is I come from Florida. I basically went to school in San Francisco. My mother was she was a seamstress, and she comes from a family of German tailors. She definitely inspired me. I grew up a lot around fabric, and I went to art school in San Francisco where I studied. Like many people, I trained as a painter, and then I started to integrate fiber and performance as well as video into my artwork as a younger artist. Was doing a lot of this sort of embodiment, sort of feminist focused work, sort of second, third generation feminist critique. As a lot of women who go to art school kind of get into that sort of oeuvre. And then started to realize that fiber was really a part of describing my history as a woman, and sort of talking about embodiment and materiality, in how fiber tells stories sometimes that we can't tell in a way that is literal or didactic. And it opens a portal for us. And I think part of, we'll be talking more about this, but part of my meeting Emily and sort of my early collaborations with her was about the notion of sight as a cultural bearer, the body as a cultural bearer. And so the first piece I'm going to talk about is silent music, and this was an important work for me because it was one of the first sort of site-specific works I created. This was at Evanston Arts Center, and this piece is about maybe 12 or 14 feet across, and it was made of cellophane and dichroic film. And this was one of the first times that I was taking sort of non-fabric material, things that were very transparent, because they had these large windows and it was like July and it was like 1,000 degrees. So I wanted to make a work that was modular, that would suspend in the window. And let's see if this, how does this, did it?
It's there. It's just,
That one, okay. So I was also very influenced by the trees in Evanston, Illinois, and was starting to use the darker parts of the cellophane to create these sort of striated elements in the work. And this is one of the first times when I was thinking really of site and location as driving how I make the work. So Spiral Dance was a piece that, Emily, I think we connected initially over social media, maybe? I'm not sure how it was kind of pre-pandemic, and she had told me about the show Remnants, and I was really excited about it. It was a group show. A lot of the artists that she was including were artists I really admired. And so I made a site-specific work. Doesn't seem to. I wonder if there's a. Here we go. Okay. So I created a site-specific work that was basically drawn on drafting film, and it was colored pencil. And I, like many fiber artists, my approach is modular. So these were 3 pieces of drafting film drawn on both sides. At the time, I was reading literature by Starhawk, and I was reading Spiral Dance, and basically neo-pagan philosophy around women's religions, and I was thinking about the circle and the dance, and this notion of finding oneself again by this notion of constantly circling inwards. That sometimes the only way that you find your way out of something is to actually go deeper. And so this piece was created for, and of course you probably recognize the space, but I remembered when she sent me the photos, I was so moved by the sheer beauty of the space. And I was like, gosh, I really hope I can do something there someday. And it began a long conversation with Emily and I as sort of really friends about this space and this relationship and the history of women makers. So the next piece I created around the same time was She. And this was the notion of the female archetype. And at this point, I was starting to look at female mythical creatures in mythical Greek myth in particular. Really resonated for me. This work was also modular. This was a piece I created in 2020, but was shown at the Maui Arts and Cultural Center in 2023. It was the first avenue for this work. This piece, again, in the 14, 15-foot range, hung with monofilament wire. They had these trusses, somewhat similar in a way to the barn in a lot of ways, because it was a beautiful wood structure, and it had these trusses that we suspended the work from. So it had this sort of floating, evolving quality to it. And because I love to draw, it became sort of this surface of pattern. And I believe that pattern tells a really important story. Phoenix was created in 2021, and this was a piece that I did for Slate Contemporary Gallery in Oakland, which was, this is an 11-foot by 11-foot drawing on drafting film. And so I drew, my studio is small, so I draw modularly. I draw these sections. I drew both sides with drafting film. It does speak to the phoenix rising from the ashes, which I thought of both. I was doing this during the pandemic, and I was also thinking about society and also thinking of myself and my life and the idea of coming from the ashes. But because I really couldn't help myself, I had to sew it together with a sewing machine. So I'm running this drafting film through the sewing machine, and my friends are like, you could just glue it. And I'm like, no, there's something, So this comes apart in about 10 or 12 pieces. Some of it, as much as I could get through the machine, because I don't have a long arm, or I forget what they're called, wide arm, the ones that... Hello. No signal. There we go. Okay, so I just enjoyed that very much, the intimacy of sewing these pieces together, the craziness of rolling it and trying to get the thing under there, and just the fun of that. In 2023, I had an opportunity to do a solo show at Fort Collins, the State University system in Fort Collins, Colorado, and they were great. They were just like, well, sure, just come up with something, this beautiful light-filled space. So I ended up getting really interested in Korean bojagi patchwork. Again, the notion of repair, and around this time I started to think of something called radical repair, which is this idea, certainly not a new idea, but the notion that if you put something together, it could actually be more beautiful than it was before it was wounded. So these pieces are part of, there's 4 of them. I call them deconstructed quilts because I used transparent materials like organza and silk, and I did a type of bojagi technique. I used invisible thread and a flat felled seam technique. and I suspended it on the wall and a little bit angling it towards the ceiling, and then I used LED light as a backdrop. This is consumer grade stuff you would put in your kitchen, but I installed it on the wall with clips, and it's a metaphor for the rising spirit. And there are 4 of them, and I became very interested in this notion of the spirit and the ways in which we know things and we don't know how we know them. It does reference back to I'm not Chinese, but my husband, my last name is through marriage, but one thing that he told me was that there is a custom where children, when a loved one dies, they lay blankets of different colors, one color for each child. They lay it over their loved one. A parent, for example, that each child lays a blanket. Because my mother died of alcoholism when I was 15, I wanted to, as I went through my life, I wanted to layer her. I wanted to enclose her. I wanted to make her story complete somehow in ways that she couldn't in real life. So these are my sort of blankets, and the LED light is a theme that you'll see a lot in my work, which is, or just the notion of light moving through something, and also the notion of water moving through something. So that's a theme I will revisit. Guardian of the Spirits was a 22-foot work made of cellophane, and at this point I started, what I would do is I'd use hundreds of pieces of cellophane and I'd intermix it with diacrylic film and silk, and I would make these sort of kind of like bloodlines. And I became very interested in the notion of weight. As an adult, I became anorexic through, a lot of women that go through this experience trauma. And anorexia, of course, in many ways manifests itself as a desire to control the body, to control a lot of things that you think you can't control. And I think the ways in which a lot of us women experience trauma is to signal in different ways through our body. So in this piece, I was really interested in expanding my body to take up space, to push against this notion that we need to be small and that our voices should be small. So it was this 22-foot piece, and I think it was about maybe 8 feet wide, I want to say. And on the other side of it, because this is at Ogden Contemporary Arts, and they had a lot of it, again, I was responding to natural light because they had it in surplus, which was great. And I was thinking about bloodlines and this idea that the piece is sort of running the history of my life. And you can see it a little bit closer here, getting deeper into this notion of radical repair, because there's so many different disparate elements in it. And then Mending Body, Mending Mind was a piece that I did in 2024. This is the first time that I projected video. It was a 2-channel video projection. The room was about 14 feet by 12 feet. It wasn't a very large room. It was shown at AIR Gallery, which is a very old feminist women's collective in Brooklyn that gave voice to some of the sort of legends of feminism, such as the artist Nancy Sparrow, Howardina Pindell. So I was honored to, be part of that co-op for a number of years. This work, this is the first time I started using a lot of white fabric in my work. White in Buddhism is about reincarnation. And so I thought about, this is one of the first times that I thought about fabric, and in particular quilt fabric, as a site of projection. I worked with a poet in New York named Aya Karpinska, who wrote a poem. I told her a story. Part of my mother's alcoholism was that she had been raped at knife point in my family home, which was something I never knew. She never told me these things, and there is this thread of silence that moves through lives. And I think the interesting thing for me in quilting is that a lot of times the truth is in the seams. It's the things that we don't say, but we sew or we make. And I think that we live in a culture now that there is a way in which we can have voice, or at least attempt to have voice, in ways that we could not maybe 100 years ago. And I'm very interested in that story of how women had voice or gave themselves agency in moments when it was not so easy to have agency. So this piece was basically projections of trimming, cutting, sewing, honoring her seamstress history, honoring the history of my German tailor family, and sort of the vulnerability around that. And it also included sound. And then this is some of the fabric. There was a sound composition that was created that included the poem itself. And I think that piece, in terms of its sort of structure, is some of the approach I'm going to take using white fabric here. Spell tapestry, again, talking a little bit about light. So I had a solo show at a gallery in Houston, and while a lot of the show was indeed 2D work, paintings and drawings, they were like, well, we have this skylight. And I was like, okay, so I made this piece, which was about 17 feet by maybe about 8 feet across, and it's a little faint on the screen. But basically, I used, if you've ever got your nails done and maybe you like the shiny type, the metallic stuff, there's this foil you can put on your nails. So I would take the nail foil, you can buy it, I think they call it like Angelina film or something. You can buy packs of it on Etsy. And so I would crumple it and cut it up and crumple it and cut it up, and then sew it in between, the drafting film, so that it was modular and suspended from the skylight. And I called it spell tapestry, this idea that healing becomes a spell. And I wanted to create sort of a canopy of that sort of space. Mending Light was an installation I did this was kind of great because I had created these large bojagi panels. There were probably about 14 of them in color, and I suspended them in this very urban space in San Francisco. My gallery was like, look, there's a space and it's super urban. And I thought, well, this will be perfect for a bunch of fabric. So I created this thing, and it had a lot of daylight, as you can see. But what was kind of magical for me was at night, the piece had LED that moved through it. And this is probably the largest piece I've done to date, which was about 30 feet, its length. But it would reflect the LED light in the window. And I called this body of light, and this notion of the embodiment of light moving through something. And it was one of the first times where I was like, what does my artwork look like in dark spaces? Because usually people always engage me for things that are very much about natural light. But then I thought about this space, and so we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Nereids, I thought I'd throw this in as just some of my work that isn't like 14 feet. So these are like 4 by 6 feet. They're very figural. And what I had done is I took nylon tulle, and the sewing line is this sort of really obsessive thing I do where I take the tulle and I run it back and forth under the machine, and I use these polyester thread, like, you know, the Fabriana, I think it's Fabriani, which it's just like a nightmare to get through the machine, but it's embroidery thread that I'm using, and I just run it back and forth, and it's this idea of the brain and dendrites and basically thought running through something. And the idea that you could move through thought, that thought sometimes breaks apart, and that sometimes even memory breaks apart and becomes fragmented. There was a larger piece that I just finished earlier this year called Lacuna. This is about 7 feet by 4 feet, because I simply cannot ever like just make something small and just leave it. Like, there just doesn't seem to be possible. So I was really interested in how we remember something and then it changes over time and we remember it differently. And so the lacuna in the brain. So this again is the tool, hundreds of pieces of tulle sewn together in different colors, so it has a variegated quality, then run through the sewing machine. And then what I do is I take them and I roll them and I hand sew them to a crinoline backing, and so you can hang the thing on the wall like a carpet, and I just use finishing nails. So those actually allow me to share them with collectors, because people are like, well, I don't really have room for a 15-foot installation, but this is work that's a little more accessible, and that gives you a detail of the surfaces. I really love the notion of color layering color, because of course nylon tulle is very transparent and the color visually blends versus blending in paint. So this is where Lenovo function keys, okay, good to know. We'll just mosey on there. The color layering color. And then Vanishing Act is a current work that I'm just about finished with. This is the first time that I actually wrote my own poem, and it is very much, it factors in trauma, eating disorders, the political moment, and what I ended up doing is the piece is all white. It is made of projection screen fabric. When you go to like big conferences and they're like, it's this big thing that's stretched out, and they use rear projection a lot of times where they're projecting things. So I took that fabric, you can buy it from literally Hollywood. I buy that fabric and I make bajagi panels with, and I'm going to show you. So this is an example in my studio, and I'll show you a detail, but they're basically, it's about maybe 15 or 16 feet now, but these types of panels are going to be the kinds of things that I might approach here. But basically this stuff is a projection fabric. This is the hospital gauze. I worked in a hospital system for about 26 years before I retired early to be a full-time artist. So there's a lot of a medical theme in my work because I worked with doctors for most of my life. And then these are sort of different types of, I'm not going to say they're antique cotton, but because they're not, but the patterns are very sort of antique. I know there's a word for it, but anyways, this notion of somehow using projection fabric as a site. So you're like, okay, sister, what are we doing here? So I learned, I love to project video in multiple, you can have 3 projectors, 4 projectors, but there's this moment where video can also be collage. It can be visual collage. And so what I ended up doing is a lot of body-based video vignettes, where I would use video mapping software that allows me to layer and collage images and then project 20, 30 different images on one screen. because you kind of draw you are able to pull the video in and collage it. And I realized, it's kind of funny, the more you work, the more you actually see that there's some like self-evident stuff that you like miss the whole time. And I realized that the collage of these images projected, so this is projected on that white fabric that I just showed you that I made. And it's basically different sections of myself, different moments in memory. There's themes of water in this work. In this particular work, I'm referencing the river of Lethe. In Greek mythology, this is the river of forgetfulness. When we work through trauma, there's a moment where I would say that there's active forgetting, because to move forward in your life every day, you have to forget on some level. But then there's also, what do I choose to remember so that I understand my life? And so there are water elements throughout this piece that I will be bringing in. So now's the fun stuff. So now we're going to talk about Penelope's cloth. And Penelope's cloth is, and I want to preface this by saying that this is not a presentation of like, here's what's happening. This is like a initial response to the space. The show is scheduled for June of 2027. And because I have often used female figures in Greek mythology in my work, and because I know that many of our, some of the founders here were weavers, and of course the history of the mills, I'm very interested in bringing in the notion of both weaving and quilting, and themes and ideas. So let's go there. So Penelope, of course, was the wife of Odysseus, who was the central figure of the Odyssey, and it's ironic to be talking about this given, like, I swear to you, I didn't learn about it from the movie. I actually, when I was in high school, I remember reading Homer's Odyssey, and I was like, this is the best epic poem ever. I loved that poem. I was a big fangirl of the Odyssey before the movie, I will say. But the story of Penelope, the wife of Odysseus, she is, of course, back at home while he's gallivanting off, and she's being sort of oppressed by all these suitors, and to ward them off, she weaves by day and unravels by night. And I love the idea of making as both devotion as well as strategy and sort of this undercurrent of subversiveness in her action. I think of women's work as patience and agency, as well as reclaiming power, and sort of the daily faithful labor of that. That's me, by the way, with Lacuna. It's my studio light, which makes everything kind of like, but it does show sort of this daily labor of doing something. I thought about the barn as a living organism and as a sacred space. And when I first walked into the barn, when I first came in, the first thing I said is, this is a cathedral. That's literally what I said, because I was just like, it was such a sacred experience. And I thought about the barn as record keeper, holder of story and memory, as well as implicit in the quilts that people have made. I do speak of women because I am a woman, but I also want to honor that there are many men today working wonderfully in the fiber arts. I don't want to like leave the guys out, because they totally do make quilts and stuff. So, but but in terms of the notion of this holder of story, and I think of Penelope as basically the keeper both of the past and the future. And my thought of using this white fabric it would be this sort of bajagi, it would be an aspect of this where it's sort of moving in a suspended way through the barn, is this idea that it's not just about I'm making this artwork. What I'm interested in is using the archive of images of things people have made or said as a site and location projected onto the contemporary object that I'm making, so that I'm calling forth. I really think that artwork in a society can be this call and response. It is a calling forth of our history. And I would propose it as a shared history of both weaving and quilting and that layering of tradition. The other thing I want to talk about is something that I learned about. So Rachel Carson, of course, is a hero of mine, and was one of the, probably part of the birth of the environmental movement. For those that aren't as familiar, she was a marine biologist who was probably one of the first people that spoke about environmental toxins and DDT. Of course, she was branded a hysterical woman, and I'm very interested in this notion of the so-called hysterical woman or the seer. If we look through history, women are often the seer. We are often the site of the median or the receiver of a spiritual message. I saw her as the seer, even though she was really criticized in her lifetime and, of course, died of breast cancer. But I think about Cedar Creek and the cleanup and the sort of the reclaiming of the water and the collaboration with the EPA and industry. And I think, I don't live in this community, but I think there is an enormous amount of courage when you refuse to accept environmental toxins and you want your water to be clean and you want your land to be clean. And I think that communities that stand up and do that, to me, there's a courage and, again, a reclaiming and a repair. So I think of it not only about the stewardship of the barn and the beautiful story of reclaiming the farmstead, but also reclaiming the water. So I am very interested in sort of a companion work to the piece, which would be a metaphor for the creek, which would be probably either organza or some type of transparent fabric in which I would sew in LED light strands, which you can do now. There's many artists working in this medium, but I love the idea of that being, because the barn, of course, is a beautiful darker space, and my nereids have that the light reflective thread. This would be thread that was in the fabric itself, that would basically move through the space as a kind of water, a metaphor for water. That kind of, again, is, I think that will pick up the weaving history more so as I think about I think of weaving a lot when I think of water. And this is me, all the crazy. Okay, I've got the hard hat and the tethering. I'm using I forget what these are called. This is just a simple lift. I was doing an install in February in Florida. But I'm really interested in hearing from you, since I've been talking for a while. What does a museum mean to you? Any thoughts on anything I've said or reactions? How the farmstead has shaped your practice and community? And what are some untold stories that you think you'd like me to tell in this space?